I sent her an email on Friday with it, but we can, I'm sorry. I will try to, please ask questions if you need clarification. So it's based on a net change in the number of jobs from the prior year. It's only provided for small businesses with less than 20 employees, and it is prorated on an annual full-time equivalent basis for employees who are employed less than a full year. There are some caveats to this credit. The total credit available to be claimed by all taxpayers is capped at $400 million. The credit must be claimed on a timely filed original return received by the Franchise Tax Board on or before the cutoff date. And the cutoff date is named to be the last day of the quarter when the claims cumulatively total $400 million. The new jobs credit has not been used up. It is for the last 2 years, 2009 through 2011. Total number of claims was 12,914 through December of last year. And the total value of all claims is just over $76 million. So that of the $400 million allocated to the program, $76 million have been used. So some issues for policymakers include that I'm planning to address. Is the new jobs credit underused? And second, does the new jobs credit encourage job creation? To determine whether the new jobs credit is underused, we might want to consider, are small businesses aware of the credit? It did receive some press coverage in 2009, but has received very little publicity since. The information about the new jobs credit is accessible from the Franchise Tax Board and on accountants' websites. But it did begin years ago when small businesses were struggling to hold on. And at that time, many could not consider expanding, so they may not have given it their full attention. And they may have forgotten or now believe that the credit has been used up since they've recognized that it had a limited value at the beginning. I also want to consider how many claims would we expect from the new jobs credit. To get an idea of how many jobs have been created in this segment of employment, that is, firms with less than 20 employees. I found some background data. Between 1991 and 2007, 20.6% of jobs in California were at firms with less than 20 workers, so about 20% of employment. In 2008, that share of employment was 18.5% at firms with less than 20 workers. So I'm going to assume for our discussion that approximately 20% of new jobs could be occurring at small firms. So how many claims would we expect? The jobs created and lost in California over the last few years. For net employment, the total number of gains or losses, between December 2009 and December 2010, California lost 47,000 jobs. If 20% of those were at small businesses, that would have been just under 10,000 jobs lost, which means, but at the same time, during that year, there were 4,800 credits claimed. That's because some businesses lost jobs while others expanded. Overall, it was a net job loss. But for 2010, December 2010 to December 2011, California gained 320,000 jobs. If we think 20% of those occurred at small businesses, that would be 64,000 net jobs gained at small businesses, which would suggest that maybe 64,000 employers could have taken advantage of this credit. During that year, 7,677 claims were made. So some employers cut jobs, other employers expanded. So we would, on average, I would think, expect more claims than we've seen. But what are some possible explanations for this? There is a time lag in hiring someone and applying for the tax credit. Your new worker, you hire someone today, they don't count towards your number of employees until time has passed. You have to hire them, then wait for the next tax filing before making your claim. 20% of job creation may not occur at small businesses. That's an assumption I made just so we could talk about some numbers. But small businesses may be hardest hit by the recession. And the credit cannot be claimed for workers who qualify for another tax credit, such as through enterprise zones, manufacturing enhancement areas, or LAMBRAs, so that it may offset, if those jobs are being created in those areas, they wouldn't qualify for this tax credit. So the second question, aside from is it being underutilized, does the new jobs credit encourage job creation? Think about the total cost of hiring a worker. It's going to be at least $21,000 a year for a full-time worker, assuming an $8 minimum wage and $2.50 in legally required benefits, which is estimated as the lowest possible cost to the employer for a full-time worker, $21,000 a year. A $3,000 hiring credit represents at most 14% of the cost of hiring that worker. On the margin, an employer may consider this, but it will only tip the scale in favor of hiring for relatively few of the small businesses out there. It's a relatively small credit. For example, even larger wage subsidies have a small impact on employment. The enterprise zone credit, which offers a 50%, not a 14, 50% wage subsidy for the first year of employment, 40% during the second year of employment, 30% the third year, and so on. For 5 years, a tax credit has found small or no, research that has analyzed enterprise zones has found small employment creation or no employment creation, depending on the study, even for that relatively large wage subsidy that's associated with other credits also. There are additional risks for small businesses. The $400 million credit cap may be reached before that business claims their credit, and that may restrict them from believing that they're necessarily going to get that as a sure thing when they hire a worker. The Franchise Tax Board website, with the monthly updates on the usage at this point, should allay those fears. The credits only create value in 1 year, while the business would foresee keeping that worker on payroll for many years. This is a $3,000 one-time value. And employers may be waiting to grow when the economy is more stable. Right? You're welcome.
Thank you very much. Ms. Kammerer.
Thank you very much, committee members and chairs. Lori, oh, thank you. Put that up there closer, huh? It comes when you're short. Lori Kammerer, Kammerer & Company, and I'm here today on behalf of Small Business California and the Coalition of Small and Disabled Veteran Businesses. Small Business California represents about 5,000 small businesses in California. The coalition represents the interests of about 17,000 small businesses who contract with the state of California. But mostly today I'm here on behalf of Small Business California because they're the mom and pop shops. Those are the members of the organization. And we're here to support the new jobs credit. We believe that it is very helpful in incentivizing small businesses to hire and provide more jobs. I think from the dialogue that we've had with the members of the organization is that the credit is low and that we'd like to look at ways to increase that credit. And one of the comments that the professor had made, average cost to have an employee is about $21,000. I think you were saying some of the insurance was $2 and something. Well, that's not even workers' compensation in California. So I think you're very conservative in your.
It was a national statistic.
Thank you. And that would be why. So, and I would think it would be much more expensive. So that's kind of an argument of putting maybe a higher a tax credit out there for small businesses. Also, SBCal did a survey earlier this year, and about 2,000 responses, even though, which is a low sampling, but we expect to get, I think we have another 600 coming in, responses from small businesses. And we asked them the question as far as the new jobs credit, the hiring credit, and 80% of them did not know about the hiring credit. That's 80%. Interestingly, too, is 72% of them did not know about the health care tax credit. So I think, and we've testified on this issue before in, I think, Assembly Rev and Tax, is that I think we have an education and outreach issue for small businesses. I think that as the associations, representing small businesses, insurance companies, perhaps anyone who's working with small businesses, maybe even the state organizations, EDD, et cetera, that we need to let small businesses know that these tax credits are there for them. I also think that we may want to look at other ways to utilize that money, and I know that there are several bills out there this year that are looking to what do we do with that $376 million pot of money, and how can we best get it into the hands of the small businesses. So I think that Small Business California is open to looking at all proposals that would increase the access to capital to small businesses. Any questions? Thank you.
Thanks very much, and we'll save it all questions
right.
to the end. So next, we're going to hear some comments about the California Film and Television Tax Credit Program. First, we have Brian Sala from the California Research Bureau.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. My name is Brian Sala. I'm the Acting Director of the California Research Bureau. For those of you who are not familiar with us, we're a part of the California State Library, and our mandate is to provide custom research work for the legislature, the governor's office, and other constitutional officers. I'm going to talk a little bit about the film industry tax credit today. I'll be pretty brief. I provided some written comments for you as well. As you know, in February 2009, the legislature passed and the governor signed into law ABX 315, which created a tax credit program for the film industry, film and television industry. The law provided for 2 years of tax credits against state sales and use taxes for certain expenditures for qualifying film and television productions, and additionally, beginning in 2011, tax credit against personal and corporate income taxes for certain qualifying expenditures. We had some discussion earlier about the film industry tax credit in earlier panels, noting that this is a capped benefit. So this is literally a case where certain productions are winners of a lottery because the California Film Commission receives, at least for the last 2 years, far more applications at the start of the allocation process than they can fund under the capped limit. The focus on my comments this morning will be on two topics. First, what does the historical data on industry employment and wages and production say about the demand for this incentive program, looking at the industry overall and how it has reacted to the growth of film incentive programs in other states. So the story there is the threat of runaway production, the exit of production outside of California to other states and other countries. And second, what evidence do we have about the effectiveness or the cost effectiveness of this program? And frankly, the evidence is pretty limited so far. So first, I want to just look quickly at some of the data on employment and wage trends in California for the industry. And I'm looking specifically at one narrow measure of the industry, and that's employment, establishments, and wages in the movie and video production segment. So it's not the totality of the industry, but it's the focus of the tax credit, or at least the direct effects of the tax credit. So if you'll turn very quickly to the page 3 of the handout, there's a table there, figure 1, which plots the number of establishments in California, and specifically in Los Angeles County, outside of Los Angeles and the rest of California, and the rest of the country outside of California, the number of establishments in the motion picture and video production industry. And what this figure shows on page 3 is a slow decline in the number of establishments inside of California since about 1997, 1998. Whereas for the rest of the country, the number of establishments is held pretty constant over this period. So the reason for looking at this is other states began to implement their own film incentive programs beginning in about 2002, and by about 2008, 2009, on the order of 44 states had other states had implemented their own film incentive programs. So one of the concerns underlying California's program was this fear that incentives in other states had created a strong incentive to pull particularly feature film productions outside of California to other states. So this first measure just asks what's happened to the number of establishments inside the state. On the next page are two more figures. Figure 2 looks at the number of jobs in the same segment, again by inside of Los Angeles County, the rest of California, and the rest of the country. And what we observed there is there was a dip in the number of jobs in Los Angeles County, the lion's share of employment in the state in this industry, between about 1997 and the early 2000s, and then a recovery. And that the number of jobs in Los Angeles County in this industry segment is in the ballpark of the same number of jobs in the rest of the country combined. Figure 3 looks at the average number of employees in motion picture and video production establishments, so combining the information from the first two figures to note that there's been a change in the size of the typical establishment inside of Los Angeles County. There was, as you can see in the late part of the 1990s, early part of the 2000s, a dip in the average size in establishments, and then a rise in the size of establishments as the number of establishments went down. So you see some consolidation in the industry. And then finally on page 5, figure 4 looks at average wages in this industry, again by the 3 geographic segments. And these are nominal wages. And basically what this shows is there's no obvious dip in wages in the California economy that is consistent with the rise of film industry credits outside the state. You can see that there is a slow increase in nominal wages over the time period overall. So there's no real burning evidence here that the industry was suffering deeply in terms of runaway production when you look at this aggregate figure of motion picture and video production businesses inside of the state. There's another way to look at the information on production inside the state, and that's to look at actual productions. So again, has there been a change in the number of productions that stay home versus go outside the state? We don't have the go outside the state part, but we do have a reasonable measure of the stay home part of the state, and that's permitted production days collected by Film LA for the LA County, LAC area, and some affiliated cities. And that's figure 5 on page 6. And the take-home message from this figure is that there appears to have been a shift in composition in the industry away from feature film production towards television production in the state, and an overall increase in the size of the industry as measured by permitted production days. So these are on-location shoot days in LA. So the take-home message from this portion of the story is we don't have really strong evidence of runaway production having a significant deleterious effect on the industry overall, although there is some evidence that feature film production declined over the period, and maybe that was related to the implementation of film incentives in other states. Okay, so there's some evidence that suggests that the original intent of the legislation is fairly well targeted at feature films, and they were trying to do something about it, but not a big impact. The other thing I wanted to talk a little bit about is what evidence do we have, if any, on the cost effectiveness of the program. And there's not a lot of research that's been done so far. It's still a fairly new program. One major study that was published last year by the Los Angeles Economic Development Corporation has been criticized in a number of forums because of their close association with the industry. But I wanted to talk a little bit about that study because it's the study out there for us to talk about. And I think the take-home message from that study is, well, there are two. One, their conclusion that California's film tax credit system pays for itself, that the tax expenditure dollars are more than returned in new tax revenues. It's a close measure, but they claim it's at least a break-even proposition from the state's perspective. That conclusion, I think, is credible, but it's tenuous. There are some very strong assumptions that underlie that conclusion in their study, and I want to focus on a couple of those. So their basic argument is that California-based productions keep most of their dollars at home, and there's a multiplier effect applied to the industry. And second, the California's program is a high leverage program. That is, it focuses on a modest credit percentage in the allocations, and it focuses on below-the-line expenditures in productions. And both of those are quite self-evidently true, I believe. California's production keeping most dollars at home is a credible argument given the size of California's economy and the geographic concentration of the industry in the Los Angeles area. But there are a couple concerns that I would highlight that raise questions about whether the program actually pays for itself in the tax efficiency sense. First of all, runaway productions are not completely lost to the state's economy. We know from the economic analyses done of the film incentive programs in other states that one of the standard laments is that those states' industries don't manage to keep home the large share of the dollars that are being generated by productions because they're employing high-wage employees from outside the state. Well, where do they come from? We don't actually know where they come from because no one has measured that, but we can suspect that at least some of those employees are coming out of California. So it's an overly strong assumption that every runaway production would be 100% lost to the state of California. And then second, the credit is not a make or break proposition for stay-at-home production. And the evidence there comes from the California Film Commission, in particular looking at the year 2 cycle, where they made allocations to 82 productions, and we can look at the outcomes there. We actually have a natural experiment to look at with the California Film Commission's allocations because of the lottery. Some projects are winners in the lottery, and we can see what happens to them, and some projects are losers in the lottery, and we can see what happens to them. From the winners, 82 productions that were received allocations in year 2, 51 were eventually produced in California, 30 were not produced. That is, they didn't flee California, they simply were not produced. And one, even though it received an allocation, later withdrew and relocated to New York State. There were 31 other applicants who did not receive allocations. They were losers in the lottery process. 5 stayed at home. They were, I believe, all small independent productions. 17 were not produced, and then 9 relocated to other states. So we do have evidence that the allocation process, the credit program, is a deterrent to runaway production, but it's not the whole story because about a third of the applicants, even though they received allocations, didn't proceed to production. Either they weren't green-lit, they weren't able to raise the financing, or they didn't meet the 180-day startup principal photography requirement under the program, whereas about half of the programs that did not receive allocations end up not being produced. So the dominant story here is that there are a lot of projects that don't get produced regardless of whether they receive allocations or not. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Sala. Next, we're going to hear from an independent producer and give us the on-the-ground view. Debbie Brubaker, welcome.
Thank you for your time. My name's Debbie Brubaker, and I am an independent producer and a production manager. I live in San Francisco, and I'm a film commissioner there as well. I am also a member of the Directors Guild of America. Some of the movies I've produced, which are independent films, are La Mission, the Darwin Awards, Misrepresentation, Seducing Charlie Barker, All About Evil. I have a list of a number of films I've done. My job entails planning all aspects of the production. I'm sort of a nuts and bolts producer. I'm the go-to person for making a movie. I do scheduling, creating, managing the film's budget, hiring the crew, negotiating with unions and vendors for services and equipment, all while I analyze available incentives to help make the decision of where we're going to shoot the film. In the past 20 years, I've had to turn jobs down because I couldn't leave. I'm a single parent, and my son was in school. He's now in college. That could change, but I really prefer to work here. I've written a lot of budgets for shooting out of state and even out of the country, And while it's been increasingly difficult to raise money for films, I really need to use the tax credits and other incentives to make movies, but I really want to make them here. Today, over 40 U.S. states and many other countries offer financial incentives to the film industry, and they successfully lure production and post-production jobs and spending away from California. I know this personally. This has affected me and many of my colleagues. Last year, Louisiana announced that production spending there topped $1 billion. They were very proud of that. That was nearly a 25,000% increase since they introduced their incentive in 2003. Production spending in Michigan increased 16,000% since they started their incentive program in 2007. So both of these places lacked a solid film production infrastructure, and they don't have favorable weather for filming. But they managed to pull this off. Productions are moving there to access the incentives in order to get their films made. But places like these are growing businesses and training workers. And they're displaced. And so I don't know a lot of people who go to Michigan. Wherever they're getting their workers, some of it's from inside. I have many friends who've lost jobs to other states. I've lost jobs to other states. I've lost jobs to countries, and I know this just in the last 6 months. Now my kid's in college and I can go work anywhere, and I'm discovering that I'm losing jobs. So in recognition of the competition we faced with the dramatic loss of film in the jobs, I'm sorry, I'm losing my place. In recognition of competition we faced with the dramatic loss of film industry jobs and revenue, in 2009, the California legislature thankfully passed the California Film Incentives Program, Production Tax Incentive. I'm here today as living proof that, in fact, the credit you wisely enacted does make a difference, which is why we would like to keep it going. Specifically to my case in point, last summer I did a film called Knife Fight. It was written by Chris Lehane, and it was about a spin doctor in politics, and when it comes out, you'll probably get a kick out of it. We applied for the credit, and our project got approved, so we really did win the lottery for the California Tax Credit Program. Had our production not been able to get the tax credit, it is absolutely certain that we would have had to take this film to another state to shoot it, because it could have been made in any urban area. We were talking about New Orleans, and I would have been out of a job. And I really would have been unhappy. But with the credit in hand, we were able to stay here and shoot the film in San Francisco, which is where we wanted to be, logically and creatively. And everybody I worked with always prefers to work in California, but we know that the budget drives the financial decision on where to shoot the film. And in this case, thanks to the incentive, we could make the decision we wanted to. And once we were in San Francisco, our production was also eligible for the San Francisco Film Rebate Program, which is in addition to that. So we were essentially reimbursed for city taxes, permits, and other city fees, which just made it even sweeter, which is what we knew about, which is why we wanted to work there. Let me get down to some of the hard facts about what we did to underscore what I'm saying. During the course of making Knife Fight, I hired 70 crew members for 23 shooting days, but that doesn't include prep and wrap and post, because we had all those people as well. We spent over $1.5 million on payroll. We had 170 man days of extras, working as actors. We had the services of 48 different vendors, mostly small businesses in San Francisco, Oakland, and San Jose. And they were everything from Harry Stein signposting services to Discount Builders, Nest Generators, Chater Camera, Office Depot, and a little clothing boutique on Maiden Lane called Theory. All these different businesses. And we spent over $2.5 million in California. We paid benefits to our crew, which went into their pension and health plans. I qualified for my benefits for the year with the DGA on this movie, because you have to work so much in order to qualify. So let me stress another point. All of my hiring and spending was finished and audited before production actually received our tax credit. In other words, we have to show that we actually created jobs and spent our budget before we receive the incentive. That's another special and important qualification written into this legislation. And as I said before, I really would prefer to work at home, and now that my child's away at college, I still want to work here because it's where I can choose from a deep pool of actors, skilled crew that I'm familiar with already, facilities, plentiful equipment, and I can stay here with my friends. I want to continue this to be a reality for those of us who work and are dependent upon the film and television business. Now is the time when much valuable revenue needs to be and can be generated from this business. But without the incentive, California, I think, runs a dangerous risk of losing highly skilled workforce along with a significant industry. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your testimony. I appreciate that very much, although we can only question your judgment working with Chris Lehane, for those who know him. Mr. Paveo, the Executive Director of the California Tax Credit Allocation Committee, will hear from you next.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks for the opportunity to speak with you this afternoon. I'm going to, in 10 minutes, try to quickly go through the history and purpose of the low-income housing tax credit feature of state code, briefly describe how they work, and then also at the end just give you some summary information about some production data that resulted from those credits. Let's see. The California Tax Credit Allocation Committee was created by state statute in 1987 pursuant to the Federal Tax Reform Act of 1986, which created the federal low-income housing tax credit program. The model there at the federal level is to offer tax credits to induce in private investors to become co-owners and significant investors in the development of affordable rental housing, in many cases for extremely low-income folks here in California, frequently for projects that are housing homeless populations. The investors, and these days these are frequently corporate investors, typically corporate investors, frequently banks, insurance companies, others. They, again, invest their equity, become co-owners, along with a variety of other funding sources. And I'm sure you've heard in other venues that these projects take a variety of funding sources to put together. But the real linchpin is that equity that's brought in by those investors. In 1987, the state legislature also created the State of California Low-Income Housing Tax Credit, and it parallels in design the federal tax credit, but in this case, it's a credit against a taxpayer's state tax liability for, again, investing in low-income rental housing developments. The impetus behind the original legislation that created the state credit, it's a little nuanced, takes a little explanation, but at the federal level, in the federal program, there's actually a boost to the amount of federal credits a project can receive if that project's located in certain areas of the state. They're called, it's a federal term, difficult to develop areas or qualified census tracts. The state credit really was meant to help projects outside of those areas who don't get that federal boost in their federal credits. And so those projects that don't get the federal boost, of course, are going to receive less equity from those private investors by virtue of the absence of that federal boost. So these state credits were really meant to come in those cases and augment the equity brought into those projects. So again, we're inducing in taxpayers who have a state of California tax liability, and those are the investors who come in for these state credits. We make these state credits available. Again, every project that receives state credits also has federal credits involved. We actually have an organizational infrastructure that's built to oversee the administration of those federal tax credits, including monitoring those projects for 55 years to make sure they're affordable to extremely low-income residents, and that they're renting to the proper populations and renting at the correct rents. So no additional administrative resources are used. We don't get any additional state resources to administer the state piece because we're administering it in concert with the federal piece. Just to give you some summary statistics around what we did this past year. All in, we delivered federal and state credits to about 230 rental developments throughout the state, which was a significant part of of development altogether that was happening in California last year. So out of those 230 projects, 50 of them had state credits in the deal. So those 50 deals, frankly, wouldn't have happened without those state credits being in the deal, because that would have been that much less equity flowing into the deal, and they would have had a funding gap. The likely outcome, if there hadn't been state credits, is instead of 230 projects, we probably would have done something on the order of 180 or maybe 200 under certain circumstances. We probably would have been delivering more federal credits per project than we otherwise would have been. By virtue of the state credits augmenting that federal pool, it really helps us stretch those federal resources and get more projects done. Last year, those 50 projects are going to end up producing about 3,200 affordable rental units throughout California. Again, these units include housing homeless populations, so these are populations that really are in desperate need of affordable rental housing statewide. I should tell you that since 2007, these state credits have participated in deals that are delivering about 10,500 units statewide. So a significant number of units are resulting from the investment of these state credits to induce in additional equity investments from private investors. Let's see, just to kind of, in the interest of keeping this short, I should also say that the federal credits in the aggregate last year that we awarded are going to induce in about $1.6 billion in private investment in affordable rental housing in California. The state credits are going to induce in something on the order of about $72 million. So in context, this is a small piece relative to our federal resources, and yet it's a critical piece. It does significantly stretch what we can get done with the federal credits alone. So I'll stop right there.
Thank you. And just to be clear, you allocated all the credits, the state credits that were available last year.
There was a de minimis amount of state credits left from last year that we're carrying over to this year and making available this year. So I'm confident this year we will allocate all the available credits, all the available state credits.
Not to pursue this too far, was the fact that you didn't allocate the totality of the credits a function of not having otherwise qualifying projects, or was that an administrative decision to hold some credits?
Yep, very good question. There are a couple of answers. One is we, of course, respond to demand for those credits. So we get applications for those state credits. But we also have a mechanism where if demand for the state credits isn't sufficient, we do approach sponsors and swap in state for federal credit and then use those recaptured federal credits to get more deals done. So we did that last year and put state credits in play, retrieved federal credits, and got some more deals done. So we got very close to exhausting the state credits, but didn't quite exhaust them. Again, those residual state credits will be made available this year through the same process, entertaining applications. If there's a surplus at year end, we'll go ahead and exchange some state credits in and get some more deals done with the federal credits.
I see. Okay. All right. And finally, Mr. Matt Schwartz, who's President and CEO of California Housing Partnership Corporation. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and committee members. The California Housing Partnership was actually created by the legislature in 1988, a year after this tax credit was created. And one of our roles that you directed us to pursue was provide leadership on affordable housing finance policy, and particularly to focus on how to make sure the resources we have are adequate and efficient in the way they serve to create low-income housing in California. So the role that we play is to help, in fact, broker partnerships between the private corporate investors that Mr. Purveyo just described and the providers of low-income housing. So we're in the thick of the discussions between the corporations and the low-income housing tax credit developers, which gives us a unique perspective on how this credit actually works. And I have to tell you that it is working very efficiently. I listened to some of the other speakers earlier who talked about what makes a good tax credit. And they talked about, can you tell it's achieving its purpose? Well, I think it's very clear from the statistics that Mr. Purveyo just gave you. This tax credit is only handed out at the end of what's typically a 2 to 4 year process, at the end of which 100-unit development serving extremely low-income households is there. And not only is it there, but you can see the qualifying households are in the units. They are being managed properly. All the buildings have been built up to code. So essentially the state is able to kick the tires on its investment in this tax credit before any dollars are actually paid out to the developer team. So it's very transparent in that way. There's also regular monitoring by the state of California through the Tax Credit Allocating Committee and other local jurisdictions. But I want to stress that this credit, which typically accounts for about 15% of total development costs for a typical low-income housing tax credit development, is even more critical today than it was when it was first conceived of by the state of California. Today, I think I don't need to tell this body, we are suffering the after effects of a loss of state redevelopment resources. Those resources accounted for almost $1 billion a year of investments in low-income housing. Not all of it into this exact type, but much of it into this exact type. So we've just lost hundreds of millions of dollars that are typically used to provide gap financing to these developers. And at the same time, the Proposition 1C housing infrastructure bonds have also been exhausted. And those were several $100 million a year as well that would be invested in these developments. So that is a huge, huge loss. I wish I could stand before you today and say that the federal government was going to make up that difference. But I think we all know what's happening at a federal level. And I just want to give you two small examples to illustrate. We have lost in the last 2 years more than $500 million of federal housing funds in two major programs. One, the Home Investment Block Grant Program, another, the Community Development Block Grant Program that's also used for housing as well as other purposes. That's a 50% reduction in the federal home funds and more than 25% reduction in the Community Development Block Grant funds. These cumulative reductions in state and federal resources threaten to cut in half our production of low-income housing serving our veterans, our homeless, our farm workers, and to gut the infrastructure that has developed to produce what's been a healthy flow of low-income housing units across the state of California. This is not an urban program. This serves all the counties of the state, and Bill's data backs that up. It's being used through all parts, rural as well as urban. So this is a time when we really want to focus on the value of this credit. I just want to take a quick look at an example close to home here in Woodland. There's a 101 unit development that's currently under development by a local nonprofit housing group, and they are struggling to find the gap financing funds to make this property affordable to 61 of the families will be low income agricultural workers. Those units are set aside for them, extremely low income in many cases. There'll be other units that will be serving the homeless and perhaps veterans and other very low income households that have no other options in the housing market. I want to just make that point. Sometimes I talk to people who say, well, we've got hundreds of thousands of foreclosed homes. Why is the state of California investing any money in low-income housing? Can't you just repurpose those? I think those of you who have real estate backgrounds or some exposure to finance know that there's a total mismatch there between even the reduced foreclosed prices and what low-income working and disabled families and seniors and homeless veterans can afford. There is no match there between those two resources. So in Woodland, this 101-unit development is going to receive, we hope, a little under $3.5 million of state tax credits, low-income housing tax credits, and that will make up about 15% of the total cost. Without that investment, this development has no other options for gap financing. It's not a matter of having to raise rents by 15 or 20% to make up that difference. They would simply not qualify. They would not access the $12.5 million of federal low-income housing tax credits that they're going to be leveraging. They would not access hundreds of thousands of other dollars in private financing. So I just want to make that point here very close to home, the value of the credit. And I think it's also critical to come back to the partnership that these tax credits represent. This brings together corporations who are bringing to bear their many years and capacity to do oversight of real estate. And they're adding it to the local knowledge and skills of local housing developers. Together, they're providing a very powerful package of skills and knowledge and experience that makes sure that these developments that Mr. Preveo's program funds are the highest quality developments you will find. And I hope that some of you will have a chance, if you haven't already, to go out and kick the tires of some of these developments that have received this tax credit, because they are beautifully built, they're built to last, and they continue serving the low-income population of the state, which would otherwise not have that option. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those comments and questions.
I do have one. I know we're supposed to be in caucus right now, but my question is to Professor O'Keefe. Last year in the Assembly Revenue and Taxation Committee, I believe we heard 5 or 6 bills trying to reform or reallocate the new jobs tax credit bill. You provided some information that I thought was very relevant to the discussion, in that it, on average, is about $21,000 for the cost of a new employee.
At least.
At least, assuming the current minimum wage rate and some of the other added benefits that the state mandates, and that this tax credit is a one-time $3,000, so doesn't really do much. Do you have any recommendations of what could be a better use of these funds to encourage employers to hire more workers?
Broaden the base and lower the tax rate. Sincerely, I realize that's been, it's come up. It came up before this panel. That was the key before this panel. And during this panel, everybody has a vested interest in the tax credit there.
Protecting their own.
But again, it all comes back to it's a windfall for a few small businesses, which are a very important segment of our population. And certainly I can understand that politicians want to reward job creation at small businesses. That makes sense. But in the sense that if I also have trouble thinking that our government, since the money's been allocated, now it must be spent. And I'd rather let's see it go back to the taxpayers. Let's see it go to schools. Let's see it, there's room. It's, I lower the tax rate and broaden the base.
The vested interest didn't like hearing that.
I'm sorry, I know. Well, you can ask her the same question.
Well, and maybe I can pose the same question to the folks who are in the movie industry. Would that same principle of broadening the base but lowering the taxes across the board or in different areas, does that make your industry just as competitive, or do you need a special carve-out for your industry to do what you think you need to do?
We need to be competitive with the other states is the thing. And I think without having an incentive, tax incentive, we don't make ourselves as attractive. In other words,
even if you had lower tax rates?
We already have high tax rates here, and if we had lower ones, it's still going to make a difference to offer the incentive. It just, I don't know how to explain how movie producers think, but having a tax incentive makes a big difference to what locations we go to. And having lower taxes probably isn't going to make the same kind of impact as if we could, if we have the tax incentive and we have lower taxes, we're going to go to Michigan if we can make the movie there. Mm-hmm. But because of weather and other things, if we can make it in California, even if it's a little bit higher, because it's going to be a little bit higher here in California anyway, because it already is, we're going to be able to stay here, which makes it more attractive to the actors, because a lot of them live in Los Angeles, so they don't have to travel so far. We're willing to pay a little bit more to stay here. We already do that. But we don't want to pay that much more, or we are going to go to New Orleans, or we're going to go to New Mexico, or even Canada, which is a whole other kettle of fish.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Perea. Aside from and I had the question, would you trade off the credit you experience and receive versus a lower tax rate? And I appreciate you asking that question. the other side of, maybe it's not the flip side of the same coin, but related, is there one thing you can think of that would make your tax credit that you've been talking about, whether you're commenting on it academically or neutrally, or whether you're an advocate for it, is there one thing that you think would make it more effective in achieving the goal, whether it's more affordable housing or more production in California or more people hired and would be financially a sound move as well?
Speaking for the affordable low-income housing tax credit, yes, in fact, there are a couple of things that could be done. The beauty of this tax credit is it creates a partnership with private corporations who are needed to use the tax credit. And although it's a very efficient tax credit with internal rates of return that are quite low compared to other investments, there are still inefficiencies in having it be a tax credit that requires a sale, negotiated sale with transaction costs. The credit could be made refundable. That is claimed directly without going through a sale process. That would increase the net value to the low-income housing by roughly 38%. So that would be a big increase. Some of my colleagues might say, but you would ruin the partnership with the private corporations, and that would be a concern. However, the federal credit would remain, and that's the big driver of that corporate partnership. The state credit doesn't need to drive that partnership.
Okay. Ms. Brubaker?
Well, I have to say, in a lot of senses, some of our incentives are like apples and oranges, because the one that we have in the motion picture industry is a little bit different from what we're talking about over here and over here. And I couldn't really put my finger right now on any one thing other than I really do wish we had more money, just because I believe in the multiplier. And I do believe, I know that I've seen it with my own eyes. I've been in this industry for 25 years plus, and I know what happens to an area when it starts to have more production happen. And I live in San Francisco, which has got its own studio zone, but it's not considered because Los Angeles is sort of like the big hoo-ha. But when we have less production, which we've had, and I've watched it go down, because I consider Northern California almost like a separate state. No offense to everybody else, but for production, it's true. And I've seen people who've been in the industry for 20 years go out of business, because we just haven't had enough. Because shows that might have considered going to San Francisco now go to New Mexico or Michigan or New Orleans or Vancouver and pretend to be in San Francisco. I can't tell you how many movies that were supposed to take place in San Francisco go to Vancouver because they say it looks alike. And I'm sorry, I don't mean to roll my eyes, but it makes a difference to the Northern California area in a way that really makes a bigger impact, I think, than it does to the greater Los Angeles business.
Thank you. Ms. Cameron.
Yeah, thank you. I think we have George Lucas up here, don't we? So we have one production company.
He only does post things here. He works in Romania.
Oh. Okay. Not in California. I also think that it's time for us to think very creatively, and I'll keep this very brief, but Small Business California does have some ideas in terms of how we could best utilize the remaining dollars. It is a one-time $400 million cap. What we need to do is to look at how do we continue the funding coming, whether it be through capital investments, venture capital, working with other banks and insurance companies. And so I would like to share that proposal with the committees.
Please do.
That would be okay.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Why don't you go ahead?
A couple things. On the small business situation, the chair knows there were several bills last year. One of them was mine, and I think it's not so much politics. It's, small businesses are an increasingly important part of the California economy, and wanting to help small business and entrepreneurship is something we should be doing. One of the proposals last year was the one that I put in talking to the small businesses in my district, lowering the cost of doing business. Workers' compensation costs are very high, and what I was looking to do is divert $200 million of that $400 million to just provide a credit to lower workers' comp costs. Not change the formula, because that's a political nightmare, but just actually lower the costs of workers' comp for small businesses and allowing them to lower their overall costs of doing business. So would love input on that, and it doesn't have to be today. You could work through the chair and see, because you were looking for different ideas of how to make a difference. If that's something that the small business community and the economists think is something worthwhile, I'd love to know your thoughts on that. Second of all, on the corporate, spreading the corporate or lowering the corporate tax versus the incentive in relation to the entertainment industry, the tax rate is corporate-based. The incentive is job-based, and I think that's why it's a different perspective, and that's when you hear Ms. Brubaker talk about the other states, they're providing the incentive for creating the jobs. The corporation's going to get the benefit no matter where it shoots, and so if we just focus on the corporate rate, we're really not increasing production in the state, because those other states are still going to have their jobs-based programs to take the jobs away. And I wanted to touch base on Mr. Sala's comments on the actual productions in the pipeline. And we have to be careful in making assumptions about the productions that applied that didn't go forward and making a statement that that's due to, not necessarily due to the credit, because the way the system is designed, you only have to have 60% of your financing to be eligible. So many of those productions that chose not to go forward probably had nothing to do with the tax credit. They didn't get their financing. And a more germane interpretation would be those productions that, when they didn't get the credit, left the state, because they were in the hopper to shoot here had they got the credit. So I think making a value judgment about those projects that didn't go forward and saying it's not the picture is a little bit of a dangerous analysis of the effectiveness of the credit. And looking at those productions that actually went forward but went elsewhere, we could empirically say that they would have shot here had they got the credit. So you can look at those statistics in different ways. I mean, when you look at the actual job roles of the IATSE membership, they can tell you their members are doing more work due to the credit. And again, the accountability that this project has and the multiplier effect, you hit it right on the mark. You know, in my limited career, I shot in Mammoth, I shot in San Juan Bautista, I shot in San Francisco, I shot in San Diego, and all of the local restaurants, all of the local, wares benefit from having 50 to 150 people show up in your town to make a movie.
Or even the people who already are there will go out more. I mean, I'll put things into a dry cleaner where I might not. I have more money that I consider expendable, and everybody who lives there, that's the same thing.
Absolutely. So anyway, those are my comments.
Mr. Sala, did you have a comment?
Yeah, just a couple quick comments on these points. One, just a reminder that under the current program, you get about 30 to 40 winners a year. Those are the numbers you're getting out of the $100 million credit per year. Louisiana is often brought up as an exemplar competitor. In 2010, according to BLS statistics, there were a little under 5,000 jobs in the movie and video industry in Louisiana, an average annual wage of about $25,000, compared to an average annual wage in California of approximately $100,000. So while it's an interesting comparison, clearly if there's $1 billion of production going on in Louisiana, they're not hiring all Louisiana workers to produce that $1 billion worth of value. Somewhere else, they're acquiring labor somewhere else for a lot of that work. And that is the standard lament from other states, is that they're seeing a lot of the high-value jobs being brought in from outside of state.
Okay, we could, of course, go on with this for some time to come, but it's been a very illuminating discussion, I think, and I want to thank all of you for being here this morning, for your contribution to the hearing. This is an important subject. It's a lot of money. It's a lot of jobs. It's growing the economy in California. So it's something we'll continue to work away at for sure. We have time for limited public testimony if there's anybody from the public who wishes to speak before we adjourn. Right? We have one? Okay.
Mr. Chairman and members, Chris McKaylee with the Preya McKaylee. I've just listened to the testimony, and similar to some of the comments made generally, especially earlier, but I just wanted to highlight a couple of items. The first is although corporate tax incentives are often the focal point of these discussions, I would note that they are, by dollar value, are vastly outweighed by the number of personal income tax TEPs. So they get a lot of attention, but most of the dollar value is on the PIT side. I think historically the business community hasn't seen anything wrong with the notion of evaluations and sunset dates, etc. The problem is sort of the cookie cutter approach. Mr. Perea will recognize last year's bill, Senate Bill 508 by Senator Wolk, which the business community was perfectly fine with establishing criteria by which tax incentives, new ones, would be evaluated. The second part of the bill is what we objected to, which is a blanket 7-year sunset date across the board. Different sunset dates are appropriate for different types of TEPs, just like different evaluation criteria are appropriate for different types of TEPs. The governor ultimately vetoed it. The other issue is the difficulty, what we've found historically, in evaluating effectiveness. In other words, what is a clear definition of, is this TEP effective? What you may find effective may be not effective for somebody else, or we may judge it by different criteria. On the business side, oftentimes the use of job creation is often used as an evaluator, but perhaps that is not the appropriate evaluation. In other words, for example, with the net operating loss deduction, although it's classified as a tax expenditure program, obviously we are not trying to incentivize a business or an individual's losses. So what is the criteria by which we're going to judge these types of incentives? That's difficult in establishing it. And the last point is how have we ended up with a lot of these targeted incentives? And I think historically, at least over the last 20 years, the two reasons why we've ended up here. One is the cost. In other words, as much as an economist will tell you to lower the rate and broaden the base, that's a very costly endeavor. For example, when in the 96 tax deal, when we lowered the corporate rate the last time from 9.3 to 8.84, it was worth about $280 million. Obviously, to substantially reduce that is very costly, certainly vastly more on the PIT side. So targeted tax incentives cost a lot less than lowering the rate. And the second is remaining competitive. I think the folks on the movie production credit indicated this. As much as we'd like to see an overall tax rate reduced, when many other states offer specific incentives targeted to specific industries, it's hard not to keep up with the Joneses, if you will. Hence, that's how we've gotten to quite a number of these targeted incentives over the years. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McKaylee. All right. I think that completes our work for this morning. And with that, we are adjourned.